The kitchens of Rowan Hall fell silent at 10:30 every night, once the last of the copper pots had been scrubbed and hung, once Mrs. Grimshaw had made her final rounds with her ring of keys jangling like a warning bell, once the great house above had settled into the particular hush that only very old, very grand houses seem to know. It was in that silence, and only in that silence, that Ivy Redmond allowed herself to dance. She did not dance well, by any formal measure. No dancing master had ever corrected her posture or guided her through the steps of a quadrille. She had taught herself, in scraps of stolen time, from watching through half-open doors when the family entertained, from humming the tunes the musicians played, until she could carry them in her own worn, unremarkable voice, from the simple, urgent need of a body that had spent all day bent over washtubs and ovens to move, just once, for no reason but its own pleasure. She was dancing that particular November evening, turning slow circles in the flower-dusted light of a single banked fire, her apron discarded over a stool, her arms lifted as though she partnered some invisible gentleman who existed nowhere but in her own stubborn imagination, when she felt, quite suddenly, that she was being watched. She stopped as though struck. Her heart lurched hard against her ribs, and for one humiliating moment she was certain it must be Mrs. Grimshaw, returned for some forgotten task, come to witness the one small foolishness Ivy permitted herself in an otherwise entirely dutiful life, and to report it, with relish, to the housekeeper's ledger of grievances against her. But the man standing in the kitchen doorway was not Mrs. Grimshaw. He was a stranger, tall, travel-worn, his greatcoat still damp from the rain, a leather satchel over one shoulder, as though he had walked some considerable distance to arrive at this door, rather than the front one. His face was shadowed by the low doorway's lintel, but Ivy could see enough of it to note the sharp, tired lines around eyes that were watching her with an expression she could not immediately name, not amusement, not the leering interest she had learned, painfully, to expect from certain gentlemen callers to the house. Something quieter, something that looked, if she dared put a word to it, almost like wonder. "Forgive me," the stranger said, and his voice was low, roughened by the road, though it carried an unexpected gentleness. "I did not mean to intrude. I knocked, but no one came, and the door was unlatched." Ivy snatched up her apron, her face burning with a mortification so complete she thought she might actually die of it. "You ought not to have watched," she said, more sharply than she intended, because sharpness was easier than the humiliation clawing up her throat. "A person dancing alone in a kitchen at night has not consented to an audience." "No," the stranger agreed, with a solemnity that somehow did not feel mocking. "She has not. And yet I confess I could not make myself look away. I have traveled a great many miles today, and a great many miles before that, through a world that has shown me very little worth watching. You were the first thing in a long while that seemed entirely, unguardedly alive." Ivy did not know what to say to that. She stood in the banked firelight, with her apron clutched to her chest like armor, studying this unexpected visitor, his boots too fine for a common traveler despite their mud, his hands too clean for a laborer despite the calluses she glimpsed when he shifted his satchel, his bearing carrying some indefinable quality of command, even as he stood, dripping and apologetic, in a servant's doorway seeking shelter from the rain. She did not know, standing there with her heart still hammering from the dance and the discovery both, that the stranger in the doorway was Edmund Ashby, 9th Duke of Rowan, master of the very house whose kitchen floor she had just been dancing across, returned at last, after 4 years away, to an estate he had fled, following a grief so total it had nearly undone him entirely, and that her small, unguarded joy in an empty kitchen had just begun to thaw something in him that 4 years of war and mourning had frozen past what he believed was any hope of recovery. Edmund had not intended to arrive at Rowan Hall unannounced, nor to present himself at the servants' entrance like a common vagrant seeking charity. But he had spent the better part of 4 years in circumstances that had taught him, with brutal thoroughness, precisely how little a title was worth when measured against the things that actually mattered: a soldier's loyalty, a stranger's honest kindness, the particular courage required to keep moving forward when every comfortable certainty of one's life had been stripped away. He had gone to war not as a duke, but as a younger son's understudy, commanding a regiment his father had purchased for him in a fit of political ambition, and he had returned from it, those of his men who had returned at all, a very different man than the one who had left. He had buried friends in foreign soil. He had watched, in the space of 18 months, both his father and his elder brother succumb to the same wasting fever that had swept through the county in his absence, transforming him overnight from a spare, unremarkable second son into the unwilling holder of a dukedom he had never wanted and did not, if he was entirely honest with himself, feel remotely equipped to carry. He had stayed away, first in London attending to the grim business of his brother's affairs, then longer still in a kind of aimless, grief-numbed wandering that his solicitors had grown increasingly alarmed by, because a duke who did not attend to his own estate was a duke inviting exactly the sort of mismanagement, theft, and scandal that could unravel a family's fortune within a single generation. It was a letter from his steward, carefully, diplomatically worded, but unmistakable in its warning, that had finally brought him home. Whispers had reached the man's ears, the letter said, of irregularities in the household accounts, of a housekeeper grown careless, or worse, with her authority over the staff and the stores both, of servants dismissed without cause, and others kept on for reasons that had nothing to do with merit. Edmund's steward, a cautious and loyal man named Fenwick, had suggested, delicately, that his grace might wish to see the true state of his household with his own eyes, rather than through the carefully curated reports that reached him at a distance. And so Edmund had done something that would have scandalized his late father utterly. He had travelled the last leg of his journey alone, on foot, in plain travelling clothes with his signet ring locked away in his satchel, and had presented himself not at the grand front entrance where he would have been recognized and fussed over and given no honest glimpse of anything at all, but at the servants' door, where he might, for one evening at least, simply observe. He had not expected to find a young woman dancing alone in his kitchens by firelight, her face lit with an unguarded joy so complete it had stopped his breath in his chest. He had not expected, in the 4 years since he had felt anything approaching genuine wonder, to feel it now, standing dripping in a doorway, watching a kitchen maid move through steps no one had ever properly taught her, dancing for no audience but the fire and her own private happiness. He understood, standing there, that he was not going to correct her mistaken impression of him tonight. He told himself this was merely caution. A wise man verified the true character of his household before revealing himself and inviting only performance in return. He did not yet allow himself to examine the other reason, the one that had nothing to do with wisdom, and everything to do with the fact that he had not felt this alive, this curious, this quietly and entirely captivated by another human being, in more years than he cared to count. "I am seeking a night's lodging," he said instead, which was true enough, "and perhaps some small work, if the house has need of an extra pair of hands. I have some skill with horses, and a strong back besides." Ivy studied him a moment longer, her wariness not entirely dissolved, though something in his manner, the careful courtesy of it, the total absence of the leering appraisal she had learned to brace herself against from strange men arriving after dark, seemed to reassure her by degrees. "You'll want to speak with Mrs. Grimshaw in the morning," she said finally. "She manages the hiring of household staff, though the stable-master, Mr. Coe, sees to the grooms himself. There's a bench by the fire if you've nowhere else, and I can find you some bread and cheese, though I'll thank you not to mention to Mrs. Grimshaw that you saw me, well, as you saw me." "I saw a woman finding joy where she could," Edmund said quietly. "I see nothing in that worth reporting to anyone." Something in Ivy's shoulders eased, very slightly at that, and she turned to fetch the promised bread, with a small, private softening around her mouth, that Edmund found himself watching with an attention he had not paid to anything in a very long time. He gave his name, when she asked it, as Edmund Vane, a partial truth, his own given name paired with an old family surname long since folded into the dukedom's history, unlikely to be recognized by anyone this far from London. It was not, he told himself, a lie so much as a discretion. He would tell her the whole of it soon. He simply wished, for a little while longer, to be looked at the way she had looked at him in that doorway, not as a title, not as a source of wages or patronage or fear, but simply as a stranger who had happened to witness something private and had chosen not to mock it. He did not yet understand how much that small, selfish wish would eventually cost them both. Mrs. Grimshaw hired the stranger the following morning with the particular brisk suspicion she extended to all new arrivals, setting him to work in the stables under Mr. Coe's supervision, and Edmund, now Edmund Vane, groom and general labourer, spent the following weeks doing something he had not expected, actually working, mucking stalls and mending fences and hauling feed, his ducal hands blistering and then calloused in a manner that would have horrified his late father, while quietly, methodically, observing every corner of the household he was meant to govern. What he observed, in those first weeks, confirmed and then exceeded Fenwick's careful warnings. Mrs. Grimshaw ran the household not through fairness, but through favoritism and fear, currying particular favour with a young housemaid named Sarah Blythe, pretty, quick with a compliment, and entirely willing to carry tales of the other servants back to the housekeeper in exchange for lighter duties and better treatment. Stores went missing with troubling regularity, always attributed to whichever servant Mrs. Grimshaw had most recently taken against, and Edmund began to understand, with mounting unease, that his absence had allowed a small tyranny to flourish in his own house, one that fell hardest upon those with the least power to resist it. It fell hardest, he observed with a particular and growing anger, upon Ivy Redmond. She had come to Rowan Hall 5 years earlier, he learned through careful, patient conversation with the older servants who remembered the circumstances, an orphan of 16, with nowhere else to go, after a fire had taken both her parents and the small cottage that had been their only property. The previous housekeeper, kinder than Mrs. Grimshaw by every account, had taken the girl in out of simple charity, training her first in the kitchens and then, as her aptitude showed itself, trusting her with increasing responsibility. But the previous housekeeper had died 2 years past, and Mrs. Grimshaw, arriving from a grander household with grander notions of her own consequence, had taken an immediate and unexplained dislike to Ivy that had never softened. Ivy rose earliest of all the household staff and retired latest. She was given the tasks no one else wished to perform, the coldest hours at the wash-tubs, the heaviest lifting, the most thankless mending, and received, in exchange, wages so meagre that Edmund, calculating the sum in his head one evening while he ought to have been sleeping, felt a hot flush of shame at what his own negligent absence had permitted to occur beneath his roof. She bore all of it, he noticed, with a quiet, unbroken dignity that never once curdled into either servility or bitterness. She did her work well, regardless of who watched, offered small kindnesses to the younger scullery girls that cost her nothing but her own limited time, and reserved, for the private hours after the house had gone dark, that one small unguarded joy he had first glimpsed by firelight. Her dancing, taught to no formal standard, performed for no audience, kept entirely and fiercely her own. He found himself arranging his own duties to bring him near the kitchens more often than his work with the horses strictly required. He found himself, within a fortnight, deliberately delaying his own retirement each evening in the hope of glimpsing her, through the half-open kitchen door, moving through her private steps in the banked firelight, and he told himself, each time, that this was merely continued observation, the diligent oversight any responsible landowner owed his household. He stopped believing that excuse himself somewhere in the 3rd week, On an evening when Ivy, catching him watching from the doorway for the fourth time that fortnight, did not startle or scold him away, but instead, after a long, considering silence, extended her hand. "You may as well learn properly," she said. "If you insist on watching so persistently, I'll not have you thinking me a fool for stumbling through steps no one ever taught me." "I think nothing of the sort," Edmund said, crossing the kitchen floor toward her with a wariness that had nothing to do with his disguise and everything to do with the sudden, dangerous certainty that taking her offered hand was going to change something in him permanently. "I think you dance more honestly than anyone I have ever watched in a ballroom, where every step is performed for an audience of judges rather than for the simple pleasure of moving." "You've attended balls then," Ivy said, a teasing note entering her voice as she positioned his hand properly at her waist, her own resting light and businesslike on his shoulder, though Edmund felt the contact everywhere at once, sharp and unfamiliar and entirely unwelcome in its intensity. "A groom with opinions on ballroom decorum. You're a curious sort of stable hand, Mr. Vane." "I have seen a ball or two in my time," Edmund said, which was, he reflected grimly, the greatest understatement he had voiced since arriving at his own front door, disguised as a stranger. Enough to know that very little honest feeling survives the experience. They danced then, slowly, imperfectly, to no music but the crackle of the banked fire and Ivy's own soft, half-remembered humming, and Edmund understood, turning her carefully through steps he had known since childhood but had never once felt this deeply while performing, that he was in very serious danger of losing his heart entirely to a kitchen maid who believed him to be nothing more than a groom. He was not wrong, he had already lost it. He simply had not yet found the courage to say so. The weeks that followed deepened what had begun in firelight into something neither of them could any longer pretend was mere circumstance. Edmund found small ways to ease Ivy's burdens without drawing Mrs. Grimshaw's suspicious attention, hauling her water before dawn so the heaviest of her morning labor was already done by the time she rose, mending a broken hinge on the larder door that had been paining her wrist for months, appearing, always seemingly by coincidence, whenever her tasks grew too heavy for one pair of hands alone. He learned, in the quiet hours they stole together after the house had gone dark, the fuller shape of her private grief, that she had wanted, once, before the fire took everything, to become a proper dancer, that her mother had shown her the first few steps in the kitchen of their cottage before illness, and then flame had taken that dream along with everything else, that she danced now not merely for pleasure, but because it was the last unbroken thread connecting her to a mother whose face had begun, cruelly, to blur in her memory with each passing year. "I am afraid, some days, that I will forget her entirely," she confessed to him one evening, sitting close beside him on the low kitchen bench, her voice barely above a whisper, though there was no one to overhear. "That the dancing is all that remains, and even that grows less certain with each year. I have to teach myself alone, with no one to correct my steps, or tell me whether I have gotten it right." "You have gotten it entirely right," Edmund said, with a conviction that startled them both. "I have watched a great many dancers perform every step with technical perfection and felt nothing at all. I have watched you dance exactly twice and felt more than I have felt in 4 years combined." Ivy looked at him then, in the low firelight, with an expression caught between hope and the particular fear of a woman who has been taught, by hard experience, that hope is a luxury too costly to be trusted. "You say strange things, for a groom," she said softly. "Perhaps I am a strange sort of groom," Edmund said, and the words carried a weight he could not entirely disguise, a truth pressing hard against the lie he had maintained for weeks now, with a growing and uncomfortable sense of its costs. He very nearly told her, that evening. The confession rose in his throat, urgent and overdue. "I am not who you believe me to be, Ivy, and I have deceived you longer than I can now justify, though every day of that deception has only deepened what I feel for you rather than diminishing it." He opened his mouth to say some version of it, and was interrupted, with the particular cruel timing that governs such moments in every life, by the sound of Mrs. Grimshaw's sharp footsteps approaching the kitchen, forcing them apart with the practiced speed of two people well accustomed to concealment. The moment passed, but it left something behind, a new and uneasy awareness, on Edmund's part, of exactly how much he now stood to lose. He found himself, in the days that followed, watching Ivy with a mixture of tenderness and dread that he had not experienced since the worst days of his military service, when a man learned to treasure ordinary mornings precisely because he could never be certain how many more of them he would be granted. It was on one such ordinary morning, a week later, that he witnessed the fullest measure of what Ivy's quiet strength actually cost her. He had risen early, as had become his habit, to see to the horses before the household stirred, and had come upon her in the stable-yard, white-faced and trembling, having just received word that the elderly woman who kept the village's small shop, a distant connection of Ivy's mother, one of the last people alive who had known her family before the fire, had died in the night, leaving Ivy with no kin remaining anywhere in the county. She did not weep in front of him, though Edmund could see plainly, in the tight set of her jaw and the careful, deliberate way she kept her hands busy with the harness in front of her, exactly what the effort of composure cost her. She thanked him for his condolences with the same steady dignity she brought to every hardship, and returned to her duties within the hour, because the ovens did not tend themselves, and Mrs. Grimshaw permitted no excuse for idleness, however grievous the cause. Edmund found her that evening in the kitchen garden, gathering herbs with movements too brisk and too precise to be anything but grief, held rigidly in check, and this time he did not wait to be invited before crossing to stand beside her. "You need not perform steadiness for my benefit," he said quietly. "I have buried enough of my own dead to know that grief postponed is not grief conquered. It only grows heavier for the waiting." Ivy's hands stilled among the herbs. "I have no leisure to indulge grief properly," she said, her voice carefully even. "Mrs. Grimshaw does not pause the household's demands for a servant's private sorrows, and I cannot afford to lose my place here, mourning a woman most of this house never knew existed." "Then mourn her here, with me, where no one else need see it," Edmund said, and something in the quiet steadiness of the offer undid the composure she had been holding all day. She wept then, at last, in the fading light of the kitchen garden, and Edmund did not attempt to comfort her with empty reassurance, only stood close beside her, silent and steady, until the worst of it had passed. "You are a strange sort of groom," she said again, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, attempting a small, watery laugh. "Most men in your position would not trouble themselves with a maid's private sorrows. Perhaps I have simply learned, through hard experience, that a person's true character is never so visible as in how they carry what cannot be shared with anyone else," Edmund said, and the words carried a weight that Ivy, still raw with her own fresh grief, did not think to question too closely, though she would remember them, later, as one of the many small moments in which the truth of him had stood plainly before her, waiting only for her to recognize it. The moment in the garden lingered between them for days afterward, a fragile new tenderness, neither spoke of directly, but both understood, had shifted something further still. It was into this fragile tenderness that, less than a fortnight later, a letter arrived at Rowan Hall that would make the truth of Edmund's identity impossible to conceal any longer, regardless of his own readiness to reveal it. The letter came from Edmund's aunt, Lady Augusta Pemberton, a formidable widow who had appointed herself guardian of the family's social standing in her nephew's prolonged absence, and its contents were unambiguous in their urgency. The Dowager Countess of Wraxham had, it seemed, grown weary of waiting for the Duke of Rowan's return to formal society, and had begun making inquiries, pointed, unmistakable inquiries, regarding her granddaughter Lady Cordelia's prospects with regard to his grace, prospects that had been quietly understood, if never formally settled, since before Edmund had left for his commission 4 years earlier. You cannot continue this eccentric, self-imposed exile forever. His aunt wrote, with the particular bluntness only an aunt of considerable age and considerable wealth could safely employ toward a duke. Lady Cordelia is a beauty and an heiress both, and her family's patience is not infinite. There is talk, Edmund, of Lord Fenwick's second son making his own overtures if you do not present yourself and settle the matter within the month. I have arranged a ball at Wrexham House for the 3rd week of the season, specifically to give you occasion to do so. Do not disappoint me, and do not disappoint your late father's memory by allowing this house's fortunes to founder for want of a sensible marriage. Edmund read the letter in the privacy of the small groom's quarters he had occupied for 6 weeks now, and felt something cold settle over the warmth that had been building, day by careful day, in his chest since the evening he had first watched Ivy dance by firelight. He had known, in some distant and carefully unexamined corner of his mind, that this reckoning was coming. A duke could not remain hidden indefinitely, mucking stalls and mending fences under a false name, however much he might wish to. There was an estate to govern, tenants who deserved his proper attention, a family name that required, whatever his own private inclinations, the eventual production of an heir. He had told himself, these 6 weeks, that he was merely delaying an unpleasant duty, gathering himself before returning to the burdens of his rank. He understood now, reading his aunt's impatient letter, that he had in fact been avoiding something far more frightening than duty. He had been avoiding the moment when he must choose, openly and irrevocably, between the life his birth demanded of him and the woman who had, without any calculation on her part whatsoever, become the truest thing in it. He did not yet know how he would make that choice. He knew only that he could not continue concealing his identity from Ivy for a single day longer, whatever the cost of revealing it. He found her in the kitchen garden the following morning, gathering the last of the season's herbs before the frost took them entirely, her breath rising in pale clouds in the cold autumn air, and he understood, watching her from the garden gate for one final unguarded moment, exactly how much he stood to lose in the conversation he was about to have. "Ivy," he said, and something in his voice, a formality, a gravity, utterly unlike the easy warmth of their stolen evenings, made her straighten and turn toward him with immediate concern. "What is it?" "You look as though someone has died." "No one has died," Edmund said, "but I have not been entirely honest with you, and I find I can no longer bear the weight of that dishonesty, whatever it costs me to correct it." He drew a breath, steadying himself the way he had once steadied himself before battle, though nothing in 4 years of war had frightened him quite so thoroughly as this. "My name is not Edmund Vane, it is Edmund Ashby. I am the Duke of Rowan." The herbs slipped from Ivy's basket, scattering unnoticed across the frosted ground. Her face went through a rapid succession of expressions, confusion first, and then a dawning, horrified understanding, and then something that hurt Edmund more deeply than any wound he had taken in 4 years of foreign war. A swift, defensive retreat, the closing of a door she had, he understood with sick clarity, opened to him with enormous and hard-won trust, now slamming shut against him with equal and devastating finality. "You are my employer," she said, her voice gone flat with shock. "You have been my employer this entire time. Every evening we spent by that fire, every dance, every word I told you about my mother, you allowed me to believe you a stranger with nothing, when in truth you held my very livelihood in your hands and said nothing of it." "I did not set out to deceive you for cruelty's sake," Edmund said, hearing, even as he spoke, how thin the words sounded against the scale of what he had actually done. "I came home to see my own household honestly, without the performance my title invites from everyone who learns of it. I did not expect to find you. I did not expect, in finding you, to fall in love with a woman I had every intention of telling the truth to within a week, and then somehow could not bring myself to tell for 6. You let me dance for you," Ivy said, and her voice cracked on the words, believing you were nothing more than a groom who might, perhaps, understand what it meant to have so little and treasure it anyway. I would never have shown that to you, to the Duke of Rowan, to a man with the power to dismiss me from this house with a single word, to a man whose good opinion I could never have hoped to earn honestly, only feared to lose. You did not merely deceive me, Your Grace. You took something from me I did not know I still possessed, until I gave it freely to a lie. It was not a lie, Edmund said, with a fierceness born of genuine desperation. Every word I spoke to you, every evening we shared, every feeling I confessed, none of it was false, Ivy. I am the same man who watched you dance and felt something in myself thaw that I believed permanently frozen. The title is real, and I regret with my whole heart that I concealed it so long, but the man beneath it has not changed, simply because you now know his true name. How am I to know that? Ivy asked, tears standing bright and furious in her eyes. How am I to know whether I fell in love with a man, or merely with a mask he found it convenient to wear, while he decided whether I was worth the trouble of an honest courtship? You have a countess's granddaughter waiting for you in London, do you not? I have heard the other servants speak of it, a match long understood, long expected. Was I merely a diversion, Your Grace, while the real business of your life proceeded elsewhere without my knowledge? There is no settled match, Edmund said, though he heard, even as he said it, how little that fact could possibly matter, set against the depth of the wound he had caused. There is family pressure, and an aunt's impatience, and nothing more than that. I have made no promises to Lady Cordelia, nor do I intend to. And yet you did not tell me of her existence at all, until this very moment, forced to it by a letter, rather than by any wish of your own to be honest with me, Ivy said. I do not know what to believe, Your Grace. I know only that I gave you my trust freely, the way I have given very little else freely in this life, and you took it without ever once telling me what you truly were. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture of fierce, wounded pride that struck Edmund harder than any accusation could have. I would ask leave to return to my duties now, if it please Your Grace. I find I have a great deal of mending to attend to. She walked past him without waiting for permission, her spine straight, her steps steady despite the tears she did not allow to fall again in his presence, and Edmund stood alone in the frost-bitten garden, understanding with the particular clarity that arrives only after irreversible damage has been done, exactly how thoroughly his 6 weeks of careful, well-intentioned deception had wounded the one person in 4 years who had shown him anything resembling genuine, unguarded feeling. The days that followed were the coldest of Ivy's 5 years at Rowan Hall, though no frost outside the kitchen windows could account for the particular chill she carried within her. She threw herself into her work with a grim, joyless efficiency, and found, to her own private grief, that she no longer danced in the evenings once the house had gone dark. The kitchen felt too exposed now, too thoroughly compromised by the knowledge that the doorway where she had once believed herself safely unwatched had, for 6 weeks, sheltered the very master of the house, observing her most private, unguarded self while she believed herself entirely alone. She avoided Edmund entirely in the days after his revelation, a task made easier by the fact that he had, upon revealing his identity to the household at large, immediately resumed the full weight of his ducal duties. Meetings with Fenwick, inspections of the estate's accounts, a swift and thorough reckoning with Mrs. Grimshaw's mismanagement that resulted, within the week, in the housekeeper's dismissal and the elevation of a kinder, fairer woman in her place. Ivy heard of these changes second-hand, through the astonished whispers of the other servants, and felt a bitter, complicated grief at the knowledge that the man who had wounded her so deeply was, in every other respect, proving himself precisely the sort of master a household could be grateful for. It did not make the wound heal any faster. If anything, it deepened her confusion, forcing her to hold 2 truths simultaneously that seemed, to her exhausted heart, entirely irreconcilable: that Edmund Ashby was capable of genuine kindness, of real and demonstrable care for the people beneath his authority, and that he had nonetheless allowed her to believe, for 6 entire weeks, a falsehood that had cost her something she could not easily name and could not, she feared, easily recover. She spoke of it, once, to Hannah, the young scullery girl she had befriended and quietly protected over the years, on a night when the two of them sat mending by candlelight after the rest of the household had retired. "I do not know whether I am angrier at him for the deceiving, or at myself for how easily I was deceived," Ivy admitted, her needle stilling over the torn hem in her lap. "I prided myself on my caution, Hannah. I have refused kindness from strange men my whole life, precisely because kindness so rarely comes without a price attached. And then a stranger arrived at our door in the rain, and I forgot every lesson poverty had ever taught me, simply because he watched me dance and did not laugh." "Perhaps that is not foolishness, miss," Hannah said, with the plain, unguarded wisdom of the very young. "Perhaps that is only recognizing something true when you see it, even if the man wearing it turned out to be grander than you knew. Or perhaps," Ivy said, "I have simply proven that even the most careful heart can be made a fool of, given sufficient patience and a warm enough fire." She resumed her mending, though her hands were not entirely steady. "I do not know how to trust my own judgment anymore, Hannah. That frightens me a great deal more than any duke's deception." It was this fear, more than any lingering anger at Edmund himself, that kept Ivy at a careful distance through the weeks that followed. Not merely the wound of the lie, but the deeper, more private terror that her own instincts, the ones she had relied upon to keep herself safe and whole since the fire had taken everything else, could no longer be trusted to warn her when something dangerous approached wearing a gentle face. Lady Cordelia Wraxham arrived at Rowan Hall in the 2nd week of December, ostensibly to pay a neighbourly call with her grandmother while passing through the county, though every servant in the house understood the visit's true purpose within moments of the lady's arrival. Ivy, assigned to help serve refreshment in the drawing room despite her considerably reduced spirits, watched Lady Cordelia move through the room with the effortless, glittering confidence of a woman who had never once doubted her own welcome anywhere, and felt the old, familiar ache of comparison settle heavy in her chest, the ache of a plain, poor kitchen maid measuring herself against a beauty born to every advantage Ivy had never possessed and never would. "His Grace has grown quite the recluse these past weeks," Lady Cordelia observed to the Dowager Countess, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry, whether by design or careless habit, Ivy could not tell. "One hears the strangest rumours from the county, that he spent some weeks disguised as a common labourer, testing his own household's honesty. Quite eccentric, though I suppose grief does strange things to a man's judgment. I trust he has recovered his proper senses now that the season approaches." "He will recover them entirely once the settlement is signed," the Dowager Countess replied, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who considered the matter already decided. A duke cannot indulge eccentric fancies indefinitely, whatever amusements he found in playing at poverty. There is a dukedom to secure, and Cordelia is precisely the match to secure it. Titles are not preserved by sentiment, whatever novels the younger generation insists upon reading. Ivy, standing silent and unnoticed near the sideboard, as servants are trained to stand, felt each word land like a small, precise blow. Amusements he found in playing at poverty. Was that, in the end, all she had been to him, an amusement, a diversion from the tedium of his true life, to be set aside now that the real business of dukedoms and settlements required his attention? She had told herself, in her more generous moments these past weeks, that Edmund's feelings had been genuine, even if his deception had been unforgivable. Standing in that drawing room, hearing his own family speak of his return to proper senses, as though the weeks he had spent with her were nothing more than a fever now safely broken, she felt that fragile generosity curdle into something closer to despair. She did not yet know that Edmund, watching Lady Cordelia's performance of easy charm, from across the very same drawing room, with an expression of carefully masked distaste, had already decided, with a certainty that had been building since the moment Ivy walked away from him in the frost-bitten garden, precisely what he intended to do about the whole unhappy situation. He simply had not yet found the courage, nor the occasion, to act upon it. The occasion arrived 3 days later, in a manner Edmund had not anticipated and could not, once it began unfolding, have prevented, even had he wished to. A brooch belonging to Lady Cordelia, an ostentatious thing of sapphires and gold, left carelessly upon the drawing-room mantel during her visit, was discovered missing the following morning, and the newly appointed housekeeper, still finding her feet in her position and eager to avoid any appearance of the laxity that had gotten her predecessor dismissed, conducted a hasty and ill-considered search of the servants' quarters. The brooch was found, to the horror of everyone present, tucked within a folded shawl at the bottom of Ivy's small trunk. Ivy's protests of innocence were immediate and vehement, but the evidence, damning and inexplicable, spoke louder than her words, to ears already primed by weeks of Mrs. Grimshaw's old prejudices, which had not entirely died with the woman's dismissal. Several of the remaining staff, long-time beneficiaries of the former housekeeper's favour, murmured darkly of Ivy's sudden and unexplained closeness to his grace these past weeks, and the convenient timing of her supposed theft, now that his attentions seemed to be turning elsewhere. "I did not take it," Ivy said, standing in the housekeeper's small office with the offending brooch laid accusingly upon the desk between them, her voice steady despite the terror closing cold around her heart. Terror not merely of dismissal, though dismissal without a character reference would leave her destitute and unemployable anywhere in the county, but of the particular, devastating humiliation of being believed a thief by the one household that had, for 5 years, been the closest thing to home she possessed. "I have never once taken anything that was not mine, in 5 years of service here. I do not know how that brooch came to be in my trunk, but I swear to you, upon my mother's memory, that I did not put it there." "The evidence is difficult to dispute, whatever your protestations," the housekeeper said, not unkindly, but with the particular helplessness of a woman new to her authority and unwilling to risk her own position by showing leniency where none had been sanctioned. "I fear I must report the matter to His Grace and to Lady Cordelia's family. The decision of what follows will not, I am afraid, be mine to make." Word reached Edmund within the hour, delivered by a white-faced fenwick who had, in his years of service, learned to read his master's moods with considerable accuracy, and who approached this particular report with visible trepidation. Edmund listened to the account of the discovered brooch with a stillness that Fenwick, watching closely, recognized as considerably more dangerous than any outburst of temper might have been. "Bring Lady Cordelia to me," Edmund said finally, his voice quiet and precise, "and send for the girl who discovered the brooch in Miss Redmond's trunk. I wish to hear the full account from her own lips, before anyone speaks further of dismissals or magistrates." The truth, when Edmund finally extracted it through careful and increasingly pointed questioning, proved exactly what he had suspected from the first moment he heard the accusation. Sarah Blythe, the housemaid who had long curried favour with the dismissed Mrs. Grimshaw, and who had watched Ivy's quiet closeness with the disguised Duke these past weeks, with an envy she had never troubled to disguise from her fellow servants, had taken the brooch herself during her own morning duties in the drawing-room, and had planted it in Ivy's trunk that same evening, calculating, not without some justice, given how nearly her scheme had succeeded, that a kitchen maid already whispered about for her supposed presumption toward His Grace would find few defenders once accused of theft. Sarah confessed the whole of it within minutes of Edmund's questioning, her composure crumbling entirely under the weight of a duke's direct and unforgiving attention, and Edmund, hearing the confession in full, felt a cold and absolute fury settle over him, not merely at the scheme itself, but at the broader truth it revealed, that his own prolonged absence, his own comfortable retreat into grief and disguise, had permitted a household to grow so poisoned by petty cruelty and unchecked jealousy that a woman of unimpeachable character could be so easily, so nearly, destroyed by a rival's spite. He dismissed Sarah Blythe from Rowan Hall's service that same afternoon, without a character reference, a severity some of the older servants murmured was harsh, but none dared dispute given the circumstances. He then did something considerably more dramatic and considerably more public than the situation strictly required, though Edmund, standing in the great hall where he had gathered the entire household staff to hear the truth of the matter announced, no longer cared in the slightest whether his actions were strictly required or not. "I wish it understood by every soul beneath this roof," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the assembled servants, "that Miss Ivy Redmond has served this household for 5 years with a diligence, honesty, and unfailing kindness that I have observed with my own eyes these past weeks, in circumstances where she had every reason to believe herself unwatched by anyone whose good opinion might matter to her prospects. She did not know, when she showed me nothing but honest character, that I was anything other than a common groom in this house's employ. She showed me kindness and integrity regardless, because that is simply who she is, without calculation and without audience. I will not have her name tarnished by the spite of a jealous rival, nor by the lingering prejudices of a housekeeper whose own conduct in this household did not survive my scrutiny. Miss Redmond's character is beyond reproach, and any servant who continues to suggest otherwise will follow Sarah Blythe out of this house's employ before the day is through." Ivy, standing at the edge of the assembled servants with her cheeks burning and her eyes bright with tears, she refused, on principle, to let fall in front of the entire household, felt something in her chest crack open at the public, unmistakable force of Edmund's defense. The same fierce protectiveness she had once mistaken for a groom's simple decency, now revealed as belonging, entirely and unmistakably, to a duke who had just staked his own household's good opinion on her behalf, without a moment's hesitation. It was not, she understood, watching him across the crowded hall, the act of a man who had merely amused himself with a passing diversion. It was the act of a man who loved her, plainly and completely, and who had just proven it in the one currency that could not be counterfeited, action, taken publicly, at real cost to himself, expecting nothing whatsoever in return. He came to her that evening, in the kitchen where it had all begun, finding her not dancing, but standing quite still before the banked fire, her arms wrapped around herself, as though holding in some feeling too large for her body to otherwise contain. "I do not deserve your forgiveness," Edmund said, stopping a careful distance away, giving her the space he had learned, through weeks of hard reflection, that she was owed. "I deceived you for 6 weeks, when I ought to have told you the truth within the first. I let you fall in love with a name that was not mine, and I understand entirely, if you cannot forgive me for that, whatever I have done today to defend you against a cruelty that was not of my making." "You defended me today before an entire household," Ivy said quietly, turning to face him at last, knowing full well what it would cost you with Lady Cordelia's family, knowing full well the gossip it would generate throughout the county. "You did not have to make that defense so public. A quieter word would have served the same practical purpose. A quieter word would not have told you what I actually meant by it," Edmund said. "I did not defend your character today merely because it was just, though it was. I defended it because I could not bear, for one single moment longer, to let anyone in this world believe you capable of dishonesty, when you are in fact the most honest person I have ever known. More honest, certainly, than I proved myself to be with you, and I am sorry for that with my whole heart, Ivy. I am asking, not for your immediate forgiveness, which I have not earned, but for the chance to earn it, slowly, with time, in whatever manner you require of me." Ivy studied him for a long moment in the firelight, the same firelight that had first shown her a stranger in her doorway, watching her dance with an expression of unguarded wonder she had mistaken, that first night, for the simple appreciation of a weary traveller, and understood now to have been the first stirring of something considerably deeper. "I am afraid," she admitted finally, "that if I forgive you too easily, I will have taught myself nothing from this, that I will go on believing whatever a powerful man tells me, regardless of whether his actions have earned that belief. My mother taught me to dance, Your Grace, but my life since has taught me caution, and I do not know how to set that caution aside merely because you have made one very public, very costly gesture on my behalf." "Then do not set it aside," Edmund said. "Keep your caution, Ivy. Test me against it for as long as you require. I am not asking you to trust me blindly. I am asking only for the chance to prove, through ordinary days rather than dramatic gestures, that the man who danced with you in this kitchen was never a mask at all, but the truest version of myself I have shown to anyone in 4 long years." He kept that promise through the winter that followed, in 100 small and unglamorous ways that meant, to Ivy, considerably more than any single grand gesture could have. He did not press her for any declaration she was not ready to make. He continued, with Fenwick's careful assistance. The thorough reform of the household his brief disguise had revealed was so badly needed, ensuring fair wages and fair treatment reached every servant beneath his roof, not merely the one whose favor he most desperately wished to regain. He wrote, personally and at some diplomatic cost to himself, to his aunt and to the Dowager Countess of Wraxham, informing them with unambiguous clarity that no settlement would be forthcoming between himself and Lady Cordelia, regardless of whatever family pressure continued to be brought to bear upon the matter. There were setbacks along the way, moments when the fragile new understanding between them threatened to fracture entirely. In January, a visiting cousin of Edmund's, unaware of the delicate situation, made a careless remark at dinner about His Grace's curious fondness for the kitchen staff, loud enough to carry to the servants clearing the table, and Ivy did not speak to Edmund for 4 days afterward, mortified anew by the reminder of how precarious her position remained, how easily a duke's private affection could become a servant's public humiliation. Edmund did not press her during those 4 days. He simply continued arriving, quietly and without complaint, to help with whatever burden the morning presented, until Ivy, moved despite herself by the sheer, unglamorous consistency of it, relented and permitted him back into the fragile warmth they had been rebuilding. "You could simply command my forgiveness, you know," she told him once, with the dry humor that had first drawn him to her. "You are a duke. I am given to understand dukes are not accustomed to waiting so patiently for anything." "This duke has learned, at considerable cost, that the things worth having cannot be commanded," Edmund replied. "I would rather wait 100 winters for your genuine trust than command a single hour of its counterfeit. I spent 4 years commanding men in a war that taught me precisely how little obedience is worth, set against a single moment of freely given loyalty. I do not intend to make that same mistake with the one heart in this world I actually wish to keep." And on the evenings when the house had gone quiet and the kitchen stood empty but for the two of them, he asked, each time, with a patience that never once curdled into impatience, whether she might permit him to dance with her again, not as a groom seeking a stolen moment of forbidden closeness, but as a duke who wished, quite simply, to spend his evenings in the company of the one person who had ever made him feel entirely, unguardedly himself. It was on the first evening of spring, nearly 5 months after he had first watched her dance by firelight, that Ivy finally extended her hand to him without being asked, her own small, private declaration that whatever caution she had rightly held on to through the long winter had, at last, softened into something she trusted enough to call by its true name. "You never did learn all the proper steps," she said, drawing him into the familiar space by the fire, "though I confess a duke ought to know them rather better than a groom is generally permitted to." "I know them well enough when I am dancing with the right partner," Edmund said, and Ivy laughed, the same startled, genuine laugh he had first heard on the night of the discovered brooch, the sound that had told him, more surely than any declaration could have, that she had begun, at last, to let herself hope again. "I love you," Edmund said quietly, into the small, private space between them, the fire casting its familiar gold light across both their faces. "I loved you before I knew your name, and I have loved you every day since, through every foolish week of concealment and every difficult month of proving myself worthy of your trust again. I did not understand, before I met you, that a man could spend his whole life surrounded by wealth and consequence and still feel entirely poor, until someone with almost nothing at all taught him, simply by the honesty of her own joy, what true richness actually looked like. I am asking you now, honestly, with no name but my own between us, whether you might do me the very great honor of becoming my wife and my duchess, and, if you will permit me the indulgence, my dancing partner for whatever years remain to us both." "I gave my heart to a man I believed to be nothing more than a groom," Ivy said, her eyes bright with tears that were, this time, entirely unguarded and entirely without grief in them. "I find, to my own considerable astonishment, that I do not mind at all discovering he was a duke as well, provided he continues to dance with me exactly as badly as he did that very first night." "Badly, and forever, if you will have me," Edmund said, and kissed her hand with a reverence that spoke more plainly than any further words could have of everything he had learned, in one long and transformative winter, about the true worth of an honest heart freely given. They were married the following autumn, in the small parish church at Belcross, rather than the grand cathedral his aunt had initially proposed, because Ivy had asked for it quietly, remembering her mother's own modest wedding there decades before, and Edmund had granted it without a moment's hesitation, understanding by then precisely which things mattered and which were merely the empty performance he had spent 4 years learning to distrust. Lady Cordelia, informed with considerable finality that no settlement would ever be forthcoming, married within the year a viscount whose fortune considerably exceeded his charm, and pronounced herself, to anyone who would listen, entirely satisfied with the arrangement. Sarah Blythe was never again employed in a respectable household within the county, her scheme having cost her considerably more than the brooch itself was ever worth. The kitchens of Rowan Hall, under new and considerably kinder management, became known throughout the household for an unusual custom that visiting relations found charmingly eccentric, and the staff themselves had long since ceased to remark upon. On quiet evenings, once the last of the copper pots had been scrubbed and hung, the Duke and Duchess of Rowan could sometimes be found there together, dancing slowly by firelight, to no music but their own soft, private humming, exactly as they had on the night everything between them had first, unknowingly, begun. Hannah, the young scullery girl whose plain wisdom had once steadied Ivy through her darkest weeks of doubt, remained in service at Rowan Hall long enough to become, in time, the housekeeper Mrs. Grimshaw had never managed to be, fair-minded, generous with praise, and entirely intolerant of the small cruelties that had once been permitted to flourish unchecked beneath that roof. She would tell the tale of the dancing duchess to every new maid who joined the household, always ending with the same quiet observation, that a kindness given without thought of audience or reward had a way of returning, eventually, tenfold to the one who gave it, though it might take a rain-soaked stranger at the door, and a great deal of patient courage afterward, to see that promise through to its proper end. Ivy taught their own daughter to dance in that same kitchen, some years later, in the very same steps her own mother had first shown her, in the very same firelight that had once revealed her most private joy to a stranger in the doorway, and she would sometimes catch Edmund watching them both from that same threshold, his expression carrying the identical unguarded wonder she had first glimpsed on a rain-soaked November evening, and she understood, every single time, that some things, once found honestly, were never again capable of being mistaken for anything less than what they truly were.